Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, thank you all for being here today on a very important and very pressing topic, atrocities against the Rohingya, from condemnation to action. My name is Simon Adams from the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect, and I'd like to acknowledge our co-host for this important event, the Permanent Mission of Bangladesh. The security forces of Myanmar initiated so-called clearance operations in Rakhine State on the 25th of August after an armed group calling itself the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army attacked a number of police posts and an army base. Since that date, there have been widespread reports of Myanmar security forces imposing collective punishment upon the entire ethnic Rohingya community in northern Rakhine, including women and children, through unlawful killings, sexual violence, and forced displacement. This targeted campaign has included the burning and near total destruction of more than 288 Rohingya villages, according to satellite imagery analyzed by our colleagues at Human Rights Watch. The report released this month by the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights found that the attacks carried out by Myanmar security forces were well organized, coordinated, and systematic in nature. Their aim was to drive the Rohingya population out of Myanmar and to prevent their return. While the current crisis has seized the world's attention, it has been decades in the making. The Rohingya, a distinct Muslim ethnic minority group in Myanmar, have been systematically marginalized and discriminated against for generations. The 1982 citizenship law does not recognize the estimated 1 million Rohingya as one of Myanmar's national races, rendering the vast majority of that population stateless. As a result of other discriminatory laws, Rohingya have been subject to severe restrictions on their freedom of movement as well as on access to employment and education, while more than 120,000 Rohingya have lived in squalid displacement camps since being driven from their homes in Rakhine State due to intercommunal violence in 2012. Overall, the conditions under which Rohingya have lived in Myanmar constitute a form of apartheid in which they have been segregated and marginalized. They are legally disenfranchised and even prohibited from self-identifying on the official census. Prior to the 25th of August, the Rohingya were already considered one of the most persecuted minority groups on the planet. Since then, many UN officials and entities, including the High Commissioner for Human Rights, have stated that the actions taken by Myanmar during the security operations amount to ethnic cleansing and crimes against humanity. The Special Advisors on the Prevention of Genocide, and I'm happy to have Adama Dieng with us today, and the Responsibility to Protect have also condemned the atrocities. At the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect, we believe it is evident that the atrocities committed against the Rohingya population represent a policy of ethnic cleansing and constitute crimes against humanity under international law. During September, the Commander-in-Chief of Myanmar's military, General Min Aung Hlaing, described the Bengali problem, he refuses to use the word Rohingya, as unfinished business. This raises the obvious question of what kind of finished business does the Myanmar military desire. Indeed, we believe that these atrocities, when combined with decades-long systematic persecution of the Rohingya, pose an existential threat to them as a people and may ultimately prove to be genocidal in intent. While the terms prevention and early warning are regularly intoned here at the UN, neither the government of Myanmar nor the international community has acted on evidence accumulated over many years. For our part, the Global Center has highlighted the threat of atrocities in Myanmar for 9 years and published regular warnings regarding the plight of the Rohingya since 2012. The world is now witnessing the world's fastest growing refugee crisis, with over 600,000 people fleeing to Bangladesh to escape atrocities. The majority of Myanmar's Rohingya population have been expelled with no clear path for return. And I think in this context, it's right to acknowledge the crucial and generous role played by Bangladesh in hosting these refugees. Yet, while there's been progress in addressing humanitarian needs, including via the donor conference that took place yesterday, we are yet to witness meaningful action on the international political front. The principle of the responsibility to protect was adopted at the UN World Summit in 2005 following the shameful failure of the international community to adequately respond to mass atrocities committed in Rwanda and former Yugoslavia in the 1990s. Silence and inaction in the face of atrocities then tainted the reputation and credibility of the UN and the international community. We must not repeat the mistakes of the past. The government of Myanmar has a primary responsibility to protect all its diverse populations, regardless of ethnicity, religion, or citizenship status. And despite the transition to democracy, the current government appears manifestly unwilling to uphold that responsibility. The international community must therefore take appropriate and timely diplomatic action and uphold its responsibility. This meeting will explore various tracks that the international community can pursue, including through the Security Council, the General Assembly, as well as regional and bilateral action. The international community can no longer prevent atrocities from happening in Myanmar, but it can take action to help end them and to hold perpetrators accountable. And now it is my honor to invite the former Foreign Minister of Bangladesh and Honorable Chairperson of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Dr. Dipu Moni, to speak.
Thank you. Mr. Moderator, Excellencies, distinguished friends and colleagues, we thank you for being here with us. We are grateful to the Global Center for partnering with us on this event. We wanted to have an interactive discussion in the presence of member states, UN, and other regional entities and civil society organizations. The question may arise, why this and why now? The answer can mainly be three from our perspective. One, the Rohingya humanitarian crisis is fading off international media headlines. The situation, though, remains extremely volatile and uncertain. Beyond the initial shock, dismay, and condemnation, attention must be now given to concrete action for seeking peaceful, just, and viable solution to this crisis. Two, there is some information going around about the situation getting stabilized and the bilateral engagements between Bangladesh and Myanmar having reached common understanding towards solution to the crisis. We perhaps owe it to member states and other interested partners to give them an honest assessment of the situation, not least in order to manage expectations. Three, Bangladesh remains committed to meaningful bilateral dialogue and engagements with Myanmar. We are, however, convinced from 4 decades of experience that the complexity of the Rohingya issue cannot be resolved only through bilateral overtures and initiatives from our side. We have tried for many years, and no one can blame our government for not trying enough and hard. With nearly 600,000 people now pushed into our territory in 2 months, the international community must show that it cares and is ready to act when it is most needed. The question would obviously arise, what kind of action are we looking at? Our Honorable Prime Minister, in her general debate statement in September, presented a 5-point action agenda. Under the current evolving scenario, those actions can have 2 main aspects. First, responding to the immediate humanitarian needs of the affected and forcibly displaced Rohingya and other communities. This is, however, not the main focus of this meeting. Our Honorable Speaker spoke here at an open briefing convened by OCHA last week. Just yesterday in Geneva, a pledging conference was held where the international community offered $335 million against UN's call for $434 million for life-saving assistance till February next year. I would only make 2 points here. One, Bangladesh will probably have to deal with more than 1 million Rohingya already in our territory way past February 2017. In a densely populated border area with severe monsoon this year, we are making efforts to do as much as we can with our partners' help. As the Rohingya continue to flee a regime of fear and destitution, their immediate priority is to have an assurance of safety and life-saving assistance. We have already had in place an arrangement with international organizations for managing the previously existing registered and non-registered Rohingya. We consider it advisable to continue with that arrangement for the primacy of institutional coordination and coherence. Interested partners are invited to plan and calibrate their work in line with that arrangement. 2. Hundreds of thousands of Rohingya continue to cross over to Bangladesh every day because they still live in fear and because they do not always have sufficient food, water, and medicines. There has reportedly been some opening for humanitarian assistance in northern Rakhine state, but it is a far cry from the unfettered humanitarian access that is needed. The concerned authorities in Myanmar may not have the capacity or readiness to provide the kind of life-saving assistance that is required for the remaining Rohingya not to feel compelled to leave. Member states and the UN should continue to impress upon Myanmar the urgent need for change, of course, with regard to allowing the concerned UN humanitarian entities and their partners on the ground to do their work without restrictions. I should now turn to the second and most important aspect for the action required in the UN at this point. There is perhaps no second opinion about the paramount importance of finding a lasting political solution for this protracted humanitarian crisis with grave implications for regional and international peace and security. If the responsible members of the international community now falter in pursuing this, the gap would possibly be filled in by many non-state actors already seeking a foothold in the rather overwhelming situation. It is therefore critical for the international community to take a hard look at the current priorities of the Rohingya. There is perhaps broad-based consensus that Rohingya civilians must be given institutionalized public security and protection in Myanmar so that they do not have to live in constant fear and under threat of persecution. All forcibly displaced Rohingya must be allowed to voluntarily return to their homes or at least their places of residence in safe, dignified, and sustainable manner. Rohingya must be restored their citizenship in Myanmar without any discrimination, with their freedom of movement and livelihoods guaranteed, among other issues. We take positive note of some of the recent statements by Myanmar leadership to partly address these issues. As we had seen on many previous occasions, a number of initiatives in the form of committees and commissions have been announced and launched. We would like to believe that these initiatives would be allowed to function and deliver results. Some of the early signs are, however, not reassuring enough. Just to cite 3 examples among many. 1. During the Myanmar Union Minister's official visit to Dhaka earlier this month, it was conveyed to us that the Myanmar authorities would be ready to consider the possible return of only those that had crossed over to Bangladesh since 25 August. The fate of the nearly 400,000 from previous influxes would then continue to remain in a limbo. 2. During the same visit, there was an understanding reached between our two sides that a joint working group would be constituted in order to facilitate the repatriation of those forcibly displaced into Bangladesh. We had then shared a draft set of modalities to be bilaterally agreed for the joint working group to be constituted and to start functioning. Our two sides are still having discussions on this. 3. The mandated scope of work for the Union Enterprise Mechanism for Humanitarian Assistance, Resettlement and Development in Rakhine, recently established by Myanmar, dwells primarily on humanitarian assistance and development issues, and perhaps knowingly omits the issue of facilitating repatriation of displaced Myanmar residents from Bangladesh. Under these circumstances, we envisage and underscore the following possible set of actions through the UN intergovernmental process. 1. The Security Council can further build on its agreed press elements and include the situation in Myanmar on its formal agenda for periodic review of progress with cessation of violence, humanitarian assistance for all communities, safe, dignified, and voluntary return of all forcibly displaced Rohingya, and implementation of the Kofi Annan Advisory Commission's recommendations. It is the world's expectation that the Security Council would be able to consider and adopt a resolution to this effect. 2. The question of safe, dignified, and voluntary return of the forcibly displaced Rohingya is linked to the question of their protection as civilians in Rakhine State. The state has the primary responsibility to guarantee such protection, and hence our suggestion for creating safe zones inside Myanmar to restore trust and confidence among the Rohingya. The Security Council does have a role to monitor and ensure that the state demonstrates the ability and willingness to fulfill the responsibility to protect its civilians. 3. The issue of accountability is fundamental to promote reconciliation and prevent recurrence of violence and persecution. The Security Council, as well as wider membership, must remain engaged with the Myanmar authorities to impress the need for such accountability. There must be some demonstrable action against impunity for at least 10 instances of breach of international law that we can identify in the present crisis. 4. The fact-finding mission mandated by the Human Rights Council continues to be denied access in Myanmar. A special session on Myanmar in the Human Rights Council can once again make a case for promoting and protecting the human rights and fundamental freedoms of the Rohingya for a peaceful, just, and lasting solution to their unremitting plight. 5. The Secretary General needs hands-on, sustained support to stay engaged with the situation in Myanmar, especially in Rakhine State. The General Assembly can help strengthen his hands by creating a position of a special envoy as proposed in the draft OIC resolution under the third committee. The Rohingya crisis can be a real test for the member states and the UN to work towards the comprehensive goal of sustaining peace in Rakhine State. 6. The international community has rallied behind the Kofi Annan Advisory Commission's report and agreed to support Myanmar to implement the recommendations, which we hope would be done in a comprehensive and non-selective manner. The Commission report provides a roadmap for addressing the root causes of the Rohingya crisis, including the overriding need for reviewing the 1982 Citizenship Act in Myanmar. There perhaps needs to be a coalition of UN member states to help monitor and support efforts in this regard. Among other institutional mechanisms, the Peace Building Fund's experience of working in Myanmar could be further used for this purpose. This is only an indicative list of possible actions, and all of them doable without even the need for stretching consensus. The Rohingya crisis this time round has been unprecedented, and it does deserve unified, well-calibrated, timely response by the UN. The time for seeking small openings in Myanmar and then adopting a kind of appeasement strategy can no longer be the answer. Let me make it very clear. The Rohingya can no longer remain a bilateral issue between Myanmar and Bangladesh. In our foreign policy engagements, we do mark a number of outstanding issues with our neighbors and others as preserves of bilateral engagements. But the Rohingya crisis has reached such a proportion that we are now telling the world that we need you to accompany us for our bilateral contacts and engagements with Myanmar to sustain momentum. I give you one example. We have been persevering with Myanmar to conclude some border and security cooperation arrangements over the last many years. These arrangements have finally been concluded during our Home Minister's current visit to Myanmar under international spotlight. The question of repatriating more than 1 million people to Myanmar in a safe, voluntary, and dignified manner would require further commitment and painstaking work with the involvement of relevant partners from the UN. Our call for action at this meeting is aimed at achieving that shared objective. I wish to conclude by renewing our invitation to the Security Council and all member states to come and visit Cox's Bazar to see for yourself the situation on the ground. Bangladesh remains profoundly grateful to all member states and civil society partners for standing by the Rohingya and our people at this yet another time of crisis. As a resilient nation, with your support and understanding, we hope to override this protracted crisis, drawing on our commitment not to fail the Rohingya once more. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Moni, and it's now my pleasure to call on UN Undersecretary General and Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide, Mr. Adama Dieng.
Thank you very much, my dear friend Simon. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to start by thanking warmly the Permanent Mission of Bangladesh and the Global Center for convening this important event. I mean, the current crisis in northern Rakhine state of Myanmar is extremely serious. That is the least we can say. And given the recent accounts of grave human rights violations occurring in that region, we need to go beyond words of condemnation and urgently take concrete action to address the many concerns that we have. The current situation in northern Rakhine state was not unexpected. The very deeply rooted and long-standing discriminatory practices and policies against the Rohingya Muslim population, the failure to stop acts of violence against them, and the failure to put in place conditions that would support the peaceful coexistence of different communities in Rakhine State were just some of the ingredients that warned it of a major crisis on the horizon and provided fertile ground for the start of an armed insurgency. I have been following the situation in northern Rakhine State for several years and have warned it that there was a risk that atrocity crimes could be committed there. Many thought that this was not a situation that should merit my attention because, as I was told, there is no genocide taking place. We are again in a situation where we should have done more to respond to early warning signs. When we speak about preventing atrocity crimes, by which I mean genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, that means addressing risk factors for these crimes come very early on, before they escalate and became the prelude to actual criminal conduct. The current crisis is the result of failures, primarily failure of the government of Myanmar to meet its obligation under international law and its primary responsibility to protect the population from atrocity crimes. But the international community has equally failed to meet its responsibilities in this regard by letting the situation escalate to this level. What then can be done? The recommendation presented by United Nations Security Council members during the Area Formula meeting on Myanmar on 13 October are welcomed and a first step in the right direction. First of all, the violence in northern Rakhine State, whether as a result of military operations or of vigilante attacks, must end immediately. We are still receiving reports of new arrival in Bangladesh, which suggests that people are still being driven to flee. Second, humanitarian actors should be granted full access to northern Rakhine State. Third, conditions must be put in place to allow refugees who wish to return to their homes and stay in their homes in Myanmar in safety and dignity. At the same meeting of the Security Council, there seemed to be broad consensus on the importance of implementing the recommendations of the Advisory Commission on Rakhine State, headed by Kofi Annan. The report was issued before the most recent spate of violence, but the recommendation addressed some of the long-standing issues to which I have alluded previously and which must be addressed if we are to speak of sustainable peace. I am encouraged to hear that the government of Myanmar has agreed to this and, in fact, that it has appointed a ministerial committee to follow up on these recommendations. Nevertheless, true commitment will come with implementation. Any further delay in implementing the recommendations of the Advisory Commission, including on issues of citizenship, will mean further violence and destabilization for the region. The international community must also encourage the Myanmar government in this regard and support the government in whatever way possible. I would also like to highlight the importance of the government of Myanmar allowing the Human Rights Council mandated independent international fact-finding mission access to northern Rakhine State to ascertain the veracity of the most recent events. The accounts of the attacks that we have received since 25th August and before that are outrageous, and those responsible must be held accountable, whatever their status. However, I would like to add something that I consider of utmost importance to bringing peace and stability in Myanmar. It is not enough to bring the persecution of the Rohingya to an end. What will be key to future peace and stability in Myanmar will be the establishment of a national identity that all populations of the country, including those that identify themselves as Rohingya, feel a part of. The Rohingya are one of the Myanmar's populations, regardless of their origins or the timing of their arrival in the country. Ultimately, the Myanmar government will have to find a way to glue together its many ethnic and religious identities in a way that brings all those in its society to respect one another and allows all of them to enjoy their fundamental rights. I have spoken before about the example of Nelson Mandela. He understood the healing power of group identity very well. He used national identity to help unite a society profoundly divided by the racial segregation imposed during the apartheid regime in South Africa. Despite criticism from his own quote-unquote people, Mandela stood firm in his resolve that his presidency should be one of reconciliation and healing rather than of hatred and a return to civil war. In South Africa, if Mandela had not acted to address both the fears of the white minority as well as the grievances of the black majority, uniting all under their national identity as South African, the country could have quickly descended into a full-scale racial and bloody civil war, which all predicted would happen. He may well have averted a genocide. However, history has shown that identity can also be used for the opposite purpose. In many places and conflicts around the world, identity has been manipulated to feed ideologies, attain or consolidate power, or respond to real or perceived threats, and so justify violent attacks that may amount to international crimes. In Myanmar, extreme Buddhist nationalist positions and the use of hate speech and incitement to violence are on the rise. Anti-Muslim sentiments deepened after the recent attacks by a new Rohingya militant group. At the same time, militants and transnational jihadist groups are trying to take advantage of the situation, which could bring further instability to Myanmar and in the region. The deterioration of the situation is making any set of solutions more complex and difficult to achieve. Myanmar's leadership must gain control over the narrative of the future of the nation. It must be able to build pride in its diversity and address the concerns of the different communities in a way that they all feel taken care of. The transition to democracy is a golden opportunity to bring all populations together, with all working towards peace and development. No community, including those that do not share the same religious or ethnic identity, must be excluded. It is the responsibility and the obligations of the government of Myanmar to unite its people and build a peaceful and inclusive society. And it is also our responsibility as international community to support that process in a principled way. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Under-Secretary General, for those very passionate and insightful comments. And I'm now pleased to call on the Permanent Observer of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, His Excellency Ambassador Akshin Medjev.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Madam Minister, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me at the beginning to thank the Global Center and the Permanent Mission of Bangladesh to the United Nations for organizing this important and timely event. The renewed outbreak of violence and the indiscriminate use of force against the Rohingya Muslim community in Rakhine State, which has led to miserable situation affecting a huge number of civilians across the region, is a source of serious concern for the OIC and is contrary to international law. The situation has affected more than 600,000 people who have been forcibly displaced to Bangladesh, in addition to the burning of their houses and places of worship. The Rohingya minority continue to suffer and endure serious violations of their rights. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation condemns the renewed outbreak of violence affecting the Rohingya minority and the systematic and organized destruction of many villages and homes by vigilante groups. These events violate the basic rights of the Rohingya and represent a grave violation of Myanmar's government's international commitments to protect civilians. Such incidents of violence only serve to exacerbate tension and fuel instability. The government of Myanmar has failed to take responsibility for acts of violence perpetrated by security forces against the civilian population of Rakhine State. The OIC has expressed to the Myanmar government the need for security forces to apply maximum restraint over civilian populations and also to prevent the right-wing extremist groups from fanning the flames of religious hatred. The denial of the basic rights of the Rohingya only serves to exacerbate the situation on the ground. In this regard, we urge the government of Myanmar to cease the campaign of violence and restore basic rights to the Rohingya so they can live peacefully and productively in their country and regain their status and inalienable rights of dignity, religious freedom, full citizenship, and equal opportunity. As part of our renewed efforts to reach out to the international community on the issue, I reiterate our call upon the international community, and particularly the UN Security Council, to take action to resolve the plight of the Rohingya. Time and again, the OIC Secretary General has reiterated his call upon the ASEAN and the United Nations Secretary General, as well as the P5 members of the UN Security Council and other stakeholders to sustain pressure on the Myanmar authorities to end the violence and eliminate the root causes, including the denial of citizenship. We welcome the recommendations of the Rohingya Advisory Commission headed by Dr. Kofi Annan and urge the government of Myanmar to take steps towards their implementation, which spells out in clear terms the corrective actions that must urgently be taken. Ladies and gentlemen, sustainable return of Rohingya refugees and displaced Rohingya to their homeland in safety, security, and dignity is utmost important. The government of Myanmar should immediately restore the displaced persons to their homes and allow humanitarian and aid agencies to assist the affected people. The government of Bangladesh, which has been working hard to help Rohingya refugees and accommodate them on its territory, has borne huge burden. While expressing its support, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation urges all states and organizations to continue to provide financial and humanitarian assistance for the Rohingya refugees and necessary support to Bangladesh to face the flow of refugees into its territory. I must also express appreciation to those states and organizations that have provided financial and humanitarian assistance for the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh and encourage all others to continue to support these crucial humanitarian aid efforts. We believe that it is imperative that all the states and international and regional organizations explore all available ways and means to bring an end to the crisis facing in Rohingya. The OIC General Secretariat remained actively engaged on the issue. It convened 2 summit and ministerial level meetings on 10th and 19th September in Astana and New York accordingly. The OIC is determined to continue working with the international community to reach a lasting and durable settlement and address the humanitarian crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and I'd like to thank all the panelists and now open the floor to member states, members of the Secretariat, and civil society representatives. And I also want to acknowledge the presence of the SRSG for sexual violence in armed conflict, who's here with us today as well. I now open the floor, and I call, first of all, on the Ambassador Cizon from the U.S.
Thank you, Dr. Adams, distinguished panelists, colleagues. As we are all too well aware, thousands of individuals continue to cross the border from Burma into Bangladesh, as the Undersecretary General has just noted. And there are now more than 603,000 individuals who have fled since August 25th, the majority of them self-identifying as Rohingya. Now, today is UN Day. Many of us attended a touching ceremony here at the UN at 8 o'clock this morning. And 72 years ago, when we adopted the UN Charter to form this body, we reaffirmed our faith in the dignity and worth of the human person. That's a direct quote from the preamble of the Charter. The dignity and worth of the human person. We need to remember that when we discuss the atrocities which have occurred in northern Rakhine State in Burma, we remember that we are talking about real people, real human beings, men, women, and children, real people who deserve to have their dignity and their worth recognized, just as we all agreed to 72 years ago. Real people who have gone through unimaginable traumas from which it will be very difficult for them to recover. Witnessing the killing of children, witnessing or being subjected to rape, torture. Their struggle has been and continues to be very, very real. It is for those people and in recognition of their suffering that we are here today. We welcome the statements of the government of Burma in recent weeks, and we sincerely hope those words will transform into real action. It is time to stop all violence in the country and to restore the rule of law, encourage unity and tolerance amongst the country's various ethnic and religious groups, and to work with the international community, including the UN, to find a real resolution to the current crisis. We again and unequivocally condemn all acts of violence in Burma. But no violent act relieves the Burmese security forces of their duty to restore the rule of law and to ensure the safety and security of all individuals in Burma without discrimination. It's clear that the Burmese security forces continue to fail in this duty in Rakhine State, where there is a continued lack of law and order. There must be accountability for abuses and atrocities, both for those who committed them and those who ordered them. Yesterday, the U.S. State Department identified new and ongoing actions to pursue accountability for those who have committed violence and abuses, including, among other measures, suspending travel waivers for military leaders, assessing authorities under the JADE Act to consider economic options available to target individuals associated with atrocities, finding that all units and officers involved in operations in northern Rakhine State are, pursuant to the Leahy Law, ineligible for U.S. assistance programs, rescinding invitations for Burmese security leaders to attend U.S.-sponsored events, maintaining an embargo on military sales, consulting with partners on accountability options at the UN, the Human Rights Council, and at other venues, pressing the government of Burma to allow access to the UN fact-finding mission, and exploring accountability mechanisms under U.S. law, including global Magnitsky-targeted sanctions. Now, the government of Burma should allow immediate, unfettered access for UN agencies and other humanitarian groups to provide aid and assistance to all affected populations in Rakhine State, allowing full access, as I mentioned, for the UN fact-finding mission to all parts of the country to do its important work, and allowing the international media unrestricted access to report facts from the ground. This is all vital. We have publicly recognized and will continue to recognize the generosity of Bangladesh as hosts to such a large number of refugees. And we encourage the government of Bangladesh to allow a more extensive role for UNHCR in the country that draws upon UNHCR's unique mandate and expertise in refugee protection. And we also note the efforts of the government of Indonesia to promote access and to encourage de-escalation of violence in Burma. We welcome State Councilor Aung San Suu Kyi's commitment that refugees will be able to return home. We encourage the government of Burma to work closely with UNHCR and other appropriate UN agencies throughout the process. So the government of Burma must also ensure that conditions on the ground allow for the safe, dignified, and voluntary return of all those who have fled the violence in their country or who are internally displaced. While we welcome increased cooperation between Bangladesh and Burma, we encourage both sides to work with the international community to agree to an appropriate and workable mechanism to govern those returns. Finally, while our immediate efforts must focus on this humanitarian and human rights crisis, failure to address the long-term causes of instability in Rakhine, deep-rooted discrimination, and economic deprivation will only result in a replay of this tragedy we fear in the future. It is thus crucial that we support Burma in implementing the recommendations of the Rakhine Advisory Commission, led by former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, to address underdevelopment, shortcomings in services, access to justice, and a citizenship process for all people in Rakhine State. Thank you, and we thank Ambassador Momen and the permanent mission of Bangladesh for organizing this important and very timely side event this afternoon. Thank you. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you very much, the Ambassador of the United States, and I now call on the representative of France.
I'm going to speak in French, so there is translations. Si vous pouvez.
Oui, there's
n'est-ce pas?
Yes. Thank you very much. If everybody is ready. Thank you. And I thank the moderator. First, I'd like to thank the mission of Bangladesh and the Center for the responsibility to protect for this event, which allow us to hear about the Rohingya situation and keep it on the agenda. And I also thank the minister from Bangladesh, Mrs. Dipo Mune, and through her welcome the considerable efforts which have been made by Bangladesh to welcome more than 1 million refugees, Rohingya refugees, and I wish to assure her of the support of France in their effort of solidarity. I'd also like to thank Mr. Bernard Yang for the remarkable work he has done and his commitment to the situation in Myanmar, which is of primary importance. Maybe you heard the President of the French Republic, Mr. Macron, when he expressed himself in September in Parliament. He spoke about the situation in the state of Rakhine by qualifying the situation as ethnic cleansing. And since then, France has always said that it is concerned at the serious violations of human rights, which, and I'm quoting the High Commissioner for Human Rights, were committed by the security forces in a coordinated and systematic fashion. So it is really a humanitarian disaster and a very serious violation of human rights, which is taking before our eyes since the 25th of August. That date was mentioned. Hundreds of villages have been destroyed and more than 600,000 people have been forced to leave Myanmar to go to Bangladesh. Such population movements are unprecedented, and given that situations, we are mobilized. France is mobilized in the Security Council, where the president is month to say that the Rohingya situation in Rakhine will receive the necessary focus. We organized with Mr. Kofi Annan and with the United Kingdom in an area meeting, and I think this has helped our mobilization. We will certainly follow up this. On the occasion of the different meetings, we recalled two immediate requirements, which have also been mentioned by the Secretary General. Namely, the first demand is that the Myanmar authorities have to end the violence and ensure the protection of the civilian population without discrimination, and to quickly allow humanitarian assistance which is safe and unimpeded for all the humanitarian organizations. And in our national capacity, we contributed our support to the Rohingya population in Bangladesh and in Myanmar, and we contribute aid of more than 400 million euros for the year 2017. But I also wish to recognize the commitment of the civilian government to organize the return of the Rohingya refugees in cooperation with Bangladesh. We have heard that that's not enough, and we hope that the United Nations, and in particular the High Commissioner for Refugees, will be very closely associated with this return process, because it is essential that we are able to create conditions for return which is safe, sustainable, and dignified return for the refugees and the internal displaced persons. And we also encourage the civilian government to quickly establish a mechanism which was announced by Mrs. Aung San Suu Kyi on the 12th of October, and it is important and even essential that the Burmese authorities commit themselves in implementing all of the recommendations which have been made within the framework of the commission presided over by Mr. Kofi Annan. Finally, I'd like to point out that France will continue to work in the Human Rights Council as in the Secretary General, in the General Assembly, so that the violations of human rights against civilians, they cannot remain unpunished. That's very important. And we're going to continue in the Security Council to work with our partners in the Council to act and put an end to this negative spiral and define the path for a peaceful and political result. We have had very close discussions with our partners, and we hope that soon we'll be able to announce new measures. I thank you.
I thank the representative of France for his comments, and I now call on the United Kingdom.
Well, thank you very much. And my thanks, first of all, to the Mission of Bangladesh and to the Global Centre for organising today's meeting. We think it's particularly timely and important. I'd also like to thank Special Advisor Jeng for your remarks and for your very clear call to action on the Security Council. The first thing I want to say is that we agree wholeheartedly that this must be a top priority issue for the whole international community, and in particular for the Security Council and also for ASEAN. The United Kingdom continues to be appalled by the violence in Rakhine State. This started, of course, with the attacks by ARSA on the 25th of August, and it was followed by a clearly disproportionate response from the Burmese security forces, leaving countless dead and over 500,000 people homeless. I've picked up the calls from several speakers for greater Security Council engagement on this issue. I would say that in the various different meetings that the Security Council has held, whether it be the ARIA hosted by France and the United Kingdom last week, or the meeting in the Open Chamber, or the several private meetings that the Security Council has held, there are at least 5 points around which there is a strong level of agreement in the Security Council. Michel and Antoine have mentioned them, but let me just quickly recap. I think first, there's a strong level of agreement around the need for an immediate end to the violence. We've seen the fact that in the last 2 weeks, I think over 40,000 people have continued to flee, and that certainly suggests that they're fleeing from something, so the violence is still ongoing, so the violence clearly hasn't ended. Second, we need the government of Burma, as Michel said, to allow full humanitarian access to Rakhine State. Third, I think there's lots of agreement in the Security Council and beyond about the need for safe and voluntary return of refugees. We would certainly support and encourage Burma and Bangladesh to agree on a process to allow this to happen. But a crucial part of this, obviously, is ensuring that Rakhine itself is safe enough to attract people home. So that clearly is a precondition for safe and voluntary return of refugees. And then the fourth point around which there's a lot of agreement is on the need for accountability. And on this, we think that access for the fact-finding mission is certainly a crucial first step in this regard, but we will need to follow that up with further measures. And then fifth and finally, I think as the ARIA last week showed, it's absolutely essential now that we see the implementation of the recommendations from the Rakhine Advisory Commission. We certainly welcome the appointment of a Burmese minister to lead implementation of these recommendations, but as others have already said, the real test is whether the actions will now meet the words. And then the final point I wanted to make is that in the longer term, we believe that we must all continue to support the process of democratic transition in Burma. We've seen with some horror the results of the Burmese military's conduct in recent weeks, and this has only reinforced our belief in the importance of strengthening civilian control in Burma, and we hope that others in the international community can continue to support Burma's democratic transition. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments, and I now call upon the European Union.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and our thanks also to the organisers of this event, the Global Centre for the Responsibility to Protect and the Mission of Bangladesh. Just to add our voice to those who have expressed deep concern about the plight of the Rohingyas and the events that have driven their exodus from Rakhine State. As you may have seen, the EU adopted Council conclusions on the 16th of October, which were agreed by all 28 foreign ministers, and which set out the EU's priorities for addressing the situation in the political, diplomatic and humanitarian spheres. The EU also co-hosted with Kuwait the pledging conference in Geneva yesterday in cooperation with IOM, UNHCR and OCHA, and we're pleased that the event resulted in pledges of over $344 million to boost the delivery of critical humanitarian assistance to the refugees and host communities in Bangladesh. From our side, the EU pledged an additional 30 million euros, but in total with our member states, I think around half of what was pledged came from the EU and its member states. We set out our views on the crisis at the recent Security Council Area Formula meeting and underscored that the violence and human rights violations must end immediately and the protection of all civilians must be assured without discrimination. We condemned the disproportionate use of force carried out by the security forces and called for the perpetrators to be brought to justice in line with the rule of law. We also called, like others, for the full, safe and unconditional access to Rakhine State for humanitarian assistance without delay. We welcome the commitments that have been made to date by the government of Myanmar, including as regards the implementation of the Advisory Commission recommendations, and we also join others in urging Myanmar to cooperate fully with the fact-finding mission and to allow it full, safe and unhindered access to Rakhine State. We would reiterate our appreciation for the way in which Bangladesh has responded with great resolve and humanity to this crisis in order to provide essential humanitarian assistance, and we stand ready to work with others in the international community, including those most closely involved, to find a solution to the plight of the Rohingyas. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the European Union, and I now call upon Turkey.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. The Turkish government has expressed its views about the issue more than once, and including at the highest level at the UN premises. I'm going to give you a concise version of our position, hopefully without compromising its content. First, the military actions against civilians and violence must stop immediately. Second, unimpeded humanitarian access should be guaranteed. Third, safe, voluntary and dignified return of IDPs and the refugees should be provided. The fourth, long-term solution based on the recommendations of the Rakhine Advisory Commission should be sought. We believe that these 4 points, it's imperative that the international community should seek progress. Honorable Minister, you mentioned in your speech the Cox's Bazar and the Security Council. With your permission, I have a few remarks to say about it. The Rakhine problem, the crisis, belongs to Security Council and its formal agenda with an action-oriented policy. Relegating the dossier, informal settings and informal agenda is a disservice. Therefore, we agree with you there. Secondly, you mentioned Cox's Bazar. Our First Lady was there, our Foreign Minister was there, our Deputy Prime Minister was there. Therefore, when you go there, you see two things. The first, the magnitude of the crisis in its true sense. And secondly, the colossal, the effort and the sacrifice that the government of Bangladesh is trying to put together. Therefore, we should all listen very carefully what you say. On our part, we are more than happy to work with you on a package of assistance, and we are looking forward to the ministerial visit from your country to Ankara very soon. And lastly, Mr. Dieng has briefly mentioned rightfully, the Muslims all around the world under the impression that the international community is blind and deaf when it comes to their plight and tragedy. Now the Security Council and the General Assembly has the chance to prove it's wrong. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
I thank the representative of Turkey, and I now call on Human Rights Watch.
Undersecretary General Dieng, Excellencies, and esteemed guests, thank you to the Permanent Mission of Bangladesh and to the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect for convening this timely event. I've just returned from a field mission researching this crisis in both Myanmar and Bangladesh. While there, we told Rohingya survivors that we'd make sure that their stories would be heard by decision makers in New York and that we'd push for action on their behalf. In that spirit, I will focus on 3 areas where we as Human Rights Watch believe that coordinated multilateral United Nations action is required. First, Your Excellencies, to stem the abuses, the Security Council should pass a resolution imposing consequences on Myanmar's military Recently, the United Kingdom and the United States have announced that they are ceasing ongoing training and support to Myanmar military officials. The European Union already maintains an arms embargo on the country and has made it clear that it's suspending further invitations to senior officials in Myanmar's military, including Senior General Min Aung Hlaing. But these can only be first steps. To truly tackle the problem, the Security Council should expand these efforts to a globally enforceable arms embargo. Additionally, individual sanctions should be imposed on Myanmar's military leaders who are implicated in abuses committed in Rakhine State since August 25th, and these should include both travel bans and asset freezes. Second, Your Excellencies, we cannot put off a discussion of justice. A few previous speakers have mentioned this. Over 600,000 people have fled horrific violence and destruction in Rakhine State, most of them in just a few weeks. But as previous speakers have mentioned, the situation has its roots in systematic discrimination. Now, irrefutable satellite imagery reveals a charred landscape and the scale of destruction, at least 288 villages which were either partially or totally destroyed by fire in northern Rakhine State. In the past 2 months, my organization, Human Rights Watch, has sent 5 staff to conduct in-depth interviews in Bangladesh with more than 100 refugees who have fled 3 townships. Despite the claims contrary from the Myanmar's government, none of the people we interviewed gave any indication that Rohingya villagers or militants were responsible for burning down their own villages. To the contrary, all accounts indicate that Myanmar's security services are responsible for this destruction. But the massive destruction and arson visible in this satellite imagery is only a part of the story. Myanmar government forces has waged a brutal campaign of killings and rape, torturing and terrorizing the Rohingya population. In one case that we've documented, an 18-year-old boy from Mung Nau in Butidang Township described to Human Rights Watch how a dozen soldiers took him and 2 male relatives from a house to a nearby courtyard. When they got there, they saw hundreds of men and boys tied up. He told us, 4 soldiers took me and my relatives to the corner of the courtyard and shot each of us twice in the back. I lost consciousness. When I woke up, I saw many men still tied, and the soldiers were still killing people. Many were stabbed to death. When I tried to flee, I was shot in the chest, but I was able to escape. Scores of people were killed that day in that courtyard, including children, before the bodies were hauled off by soldiers in trucks. The total number of people killed throughout the Myanmar military's brutal campaign is unknown, but one thing is clear to us. This campaign amounts to crimes against humanity. Member states here at the UN have an obligation to stand up and demand accountability for these crimes. The General Assembly is currently discussing a resolution demanding access for the UN Human Rights Council's fact-finding mission under the stewardship and leadership of the OIC. This is an important effort, Your Excellencies, which deserves your support and attention. The Security Council should also discuss measures to bring those responsible for these crimes against humanity to justice, including before the International Criminal Court, which would require the Council to use its power of referral. Finally, as Human Rights Watch, we believe it's imperative for governments to counter the misinformation that's being spread by Myanmar's authorities. In early September, Rakhine State Minister for Border Security, Colonel Phon Tint, denied reports of military abuses, specifically sexual violence. Where is the proof, he asked. Look at those women who are making those claims. Would anyone want to rape them? Our research shows otherwise. Through the accounts our researchers have collected from refugees, it's clear that rape and other forms of sexual violence have been widespread, systematic, brutal, humiliating, and traumatic. A 15-year-old from Hathipara village in Mungdao Township told our researchers that she was dragged across the ground from her home, tied to a tree, and then raped from behind by 10 soldiers. They then left me where I was. When my brother and sister came to me, I was lying there on the ground. They thought I was dead, she said. Another recently arrived refugee I spoke to told us that she had a baby at 3 a.m. in the morning. Soon thereafter, soldiers came to her village and began to separate men from the women. Isolated from their male relatives, she told us about the brutal sexual assaults of other women she became an eyewitness to just hours after giving birth herself. Your Excellencies, please take a moment to think of that baby and the world that it was born into, a world where it was forced to become a refugee hours after it was born. Senior Myanmar military leaders have said that the military is abiding by and instructed to adhere to its code of conduct. But what code of conduct would authorize these types of atrocities, the extrajudicial killings of hundreds of unarmed villagers and the gang rapes of women? Ladies and gentlemen, earlier this month, 88 civil society organizations, including Human Rights Watch and the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect, wrote to you as members of the UN, warning that those simply holding meetings and making speeches as atrocities continue in Myanmar bear the risk of failing to use every diplomatic tool at their disposal to stop the ethnic cleansing, failing to avert further crimes against humanity, failing to live up to the promise of never again. Thank you for coming together today to assess ways to move from condemnation to action. We hope this meeting leads to decisive resolutions in both the Security Council and the General Assembly. Thank you.
Thank you, Akshaya, for those comments and report on your recent trip to Myanmar and to Cox's Bazar. I now call on the representative of Saudi Arabia.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. First of all, I would like to thank the mission of Bangladesh and the Global Center for organizing the important event. We would like to start our statement by affirming that our government has been following with deep concern the persistence of brutal violations and the discrimination against the Rohingya in Myanmar. Since 1992, at least 1 million Rohingya Muslims have been subjected to government abuses and acts of violence and ethnic cleansing by Myanmar's army and security forces, where many of them were women and children. Many Rohingya Muslims are living in camps for displaced persons and they are denied their citizenship rights. My country made a lot of efforts to put an end to this human tragedy inflicting Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar. And our kingdom was one of the first countries that supported their case in the international arena. My country also hosted many Rohingya Muslims since 1948, and their number now is exceeding 300,000. Which makes the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia the second country that hosts the largest number of Rohingya Muslims after Bangladesh. In addition to that, my country was considered one of the first states that intervened humanly in the Rohingya crisis through King Salman Humanitarian Aid and Relief Center, and sent more than 100 tons of aid to Rohingya in Bangladesh in cooperation with the international organizations for migration, and provided approximately $66 million aid to the Rohingya Muslims over the past 10 years, and pledged to pay $20 million to Rohingya refugees. We reaffirm our position to address these violations and alleviate the suffering of the Rohingya Muslims. We also call on member states to urge the government of Myanmar to respect its international obligations and to promote the protect human rights. Finally, we thank the government of Bangladesh for its efforts in providing shelters and aid to the Rohingya refugees. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Saudi Arabia, and I now call on another civil society voice, the Burma Task Force of the United States.
Distinguished guests, on behalf of its member organizations and Rohingya partners, Burma Task Force warmly thanks the government of Bangladesh for accepting so many Rohingya refugees during this crisis, as well as in previous emergencies. At the same time, we hope that going forward, charities, UN, and other humanitarian agencies will face a minimum of obstacles in registering refugees and providing food, medicine, and education in the camps. Some of our colleagues are providing relief now, and we know that working in partnership is a key to addressing short and longer-term needs. As you know well, refugees include a high percentage of women and children, as well as survivors of atrocity crimes, mass rape, and trafficking. We respectfully request that all Rohingya migrants in Bangladesh be categorized as refugees and be allowed to register to receive assistance, access to education, and work. Refugees are not just a challenge or a financial burden, but an opportunity to invest in the future of these persecuted people. The United States was founded by groups like this, seeking religious freedom. Migrants can be very motivated workers and an asset to any society, but the international community must be a reliable partner in providing humanitarian assistance. Regarding root causes of this disaster, Bangladesh Foreign Minister Mahmoud Ali has stated the long persecution and deliberate displacement of the Rohingya is a genocide. Today, Senator Bob Corker, who co-chairs the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in the U.S. Congress, agreed. Other leaders framed the situation as mass atrocity or as ethnic cleansing. In any case, we surely agree that the responsibility to protect should obligate the international community to act to stop the attacks. And yet, in the UN Security Council, all talk and no action is the order of the day. This is not a time for whispering. Moreover, the EU and the US have taken incremental steps, but it's insufficient and just a beginning. We'll wait to see what action ASEAN will take and what will happen in the Third Committee. But meanwhile, quite a few allies continue to sell arms to the Myanmar military. A final word on repatriation. We understand the Myanmar government claims that the same military that is burning hundreds of Rohingya villages will now lead the repatriation program in Rakhine State. Government spokesmen also state that Rohingya will be resettled in IDP camps, not in their home villages and ancestral lands. Burma Task Force is alarmed that UN agencies are even considering assisting such a plan. The government of Myanmar is lost in its own propaganda campaigns and if not convinced, must be compelled to stop the genocide with safe zones, as the government of Bangladesh has suggested, and peacekeepers with a mandate to defend and protect. We offer to you our recent white paper on the complex subject of safe zones and hope it can be a modest help. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Burma Task Force, and I now call upon Egypt.
Thank you, and I would like to express my thanks and my country's thanks to the mission of Bangladesh, as well as the Center for the Responsibility to Protect, for organizing this timely side event. And we would like also to express our appreciation for the efforts undertaken by Bangladesh government to alleviate the sufferings of the Rohingya community. Until this very moment, more than 500,000 of Rohingya refugees and displaced persons have already fled their homes since 25 August due to systematic practice of killing, rape, burning, and racial oppression, as have been already mentioned by some briefers. It is indeed an unimaginable scenario that made several regional and international actors, as well as multilateral entities and the world's public opinion in general, consider such unprecedented deteriorating situation in Rakhine State as a classical example of ethnic cleansing. We believe that the international community at this critical stage has a moral obligation to fulfill towards the Rohingya community in Myanmar. Defending the inherent rights and legitimate needs of the Rohingya population is a matter of urgency indeed. This is precisely why we, Egypt, utilized our presence and membership in the Security Council at the moment, aiming at comprehensively addressing this international crisis with a general view to materialize the three main demands expressed by the Secretary General from the beginning of this crisis, as well as the international community at large, plus, of course, the importance of enforcing and implementing the Advisory Commission report and recommendations headed by Kofi Annan. Accordingly, and building upon the latest collective efforts by the OIC with all relevant UN bodies, we share the joint responsibility to urge the government of Myanmar to fulfill the following points in our view. First point, while indeed condemning the terrorist attacks against the security forces of Myanmar on 25th of August, Myanmar must halt all acts of violence and discriminatory practices against Rohingya Muslims, as well as to eliminate the root causes, including the unprecedented denial of citizenship, and this is a very important issue. 2, to promptly start implementing the recommendations of the Kofi Annan Advisory Committee. 3, to take all necessary measures to restore peace and intercommunal harmony through interfaith dialogue and a comprehensive reconciliation process involving all segments of Myanmar society. 4, to take urgent measures for a sustainable return of Rohingya refugees and internally and externally displaced persons to their homeland, Rakhine State itself, in safety, security, dignity, and with ensured livelihood. 5, to prevent the further deterioration of the humanitarian situation in the Rakhine State and to ensure the right of each individual to live and move without fear and persecution based on their religion or ethnicity. 6, and final point, to ensure complete, immediate, unconditional, safe, and unhindered access of humanitarian assistance to civilian populations in Rakhine and IDPs camps. These points, and specifically the third point that I have just explained, were highlighted by the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, Al-Sharif, in a televised statement last month, something that we don't really see frequently from His Highness Al-Azhar Al-Sharif, Grand Imam. And finally, of course, I also believe that the international community needs to act promptly in this regard in order to deal with this crisis without any further delay. Thank you so much.
I thank the representative of Egypt for his comments, and I now call on Nonviolent Peace Force.
Thank you. My name is Mel Duncan from Nonviolent Peace Force. We would first like to express our gratitude to the generosity of Bangladesh for assisting the refugees who are there, and believe that this is a concrete example of living a culture of peace and nonviolence, as your mission has championed for over a decade. We have a small team in Cox's Bazar at this moment who today sat and talked with groups of women who recounted acts of grotesque violence as already described by my colleague from Human Rights Watch, and those were mainly at the hands of the military of Myanmar. They must be held accountable. In addition to the access for the fact-finding mission to Myanmar, the stories of the people in the refugee camps must also be taken into account. Secondly, there are people on the banks of the River Naft tonight, tens of thousands, as evidence that the violence is continuing, and those people are trapped with no ability to return, and so need to be provided with the adequate boats for transport and life jackets, as well as additional medical attention when they arrive, because many of them are starving. Thirdly, as a concrete expression of the international community accompanying the Rohingya people, Myanmar must not only allow unfettered access to humanitarians, but also to unarmed civilian protectors who could be there to provide an element of protection in the safe zones, and for those who are remaining in Myanmar, and for those who voluntarily choose to return. We have heard a lot over the last decade about early warning. Today's hearing represents the emptiness of early warning unless it's accompanied by concrete early responses. This is now the time for the UN and for civil society to demonstrate those concrete actions and to put reality around the talk of prevention, which is now a prevailing discourse here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mel. I'm now going to go back to our panelists for some final comments on the discussion and interventions that we've heard today. And I call, first of all, on my friend, the Special Advisor for the Prevention of Genocide.
Thank you very much, Simon. I mean, I would simply say that I'm extremely pleased to see the strong commitment from the member state around this table. I mean, starting with the U.S. ambassador, and I was saying recently the move from your state secretary, the words he used, I mean, I was very pleased. I was very pleased and said, well, things are not what people were thinking, and that your new administration is truly committed to prevent atrocity crimes. And I really seize this opportunity to congratulate you for that stand, and we are together. I should also mention that just before coming to your event, Sam, and our good friend, the ambassador of Bangladesh, I was part of a commemorative event of the 25th anniversary of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Minorities. And I think we need really to remind ourselves the importance of that declaration. And the situation today in Bangladesh, in Myanmar, shows clearly that this important declaration should have been better known, disseminated throughout the world, because we live in diverse societies, and it is extremely important that we make inclusiveness as key if we want to prevent what is happening today in Myanmar. It is important that we make inclusiveness being the core action in our respective countries, because at the end of the day, no state is immune from atrocity crimes. And that's why I'm glad that finally the international community is waking up around the issue of the Rohingya to really make possible to prevent what could turn into the most horrendous crime, the crime of genocide. So we have therefore to make sure that those who are committing these crimes, those who know about it and did not prevent it happening, they have to understand that one day, sooner or later, they will face justice. I mean, no one is above the law. And I think it is time now for those who are in Myanmar to speak the right words and to take the right action. I think the effect in the whole society can be of a much significance tomorrow, because the Rohingya are, of course, the most persecuted, but there are other problems also within the people, some of the other ethnic group in Myanmar. Let them working together. Let make very constructive management of diversity in that country and around the world. I thank you.
I thank the Special Advisor for his comments, and I now call upon Minister Moni to make some final comments.
Thank you, friends. Thank you for being here. Thank you for all your comments. State Councillor's speech on the Union Enterprise Mechanism talked about the elements of what was going to happen and what we should expect. and we were all very encouraged around the world. 5 days later, when the official notification came out, the word repatriation went missing. While the regime is still talking about taking steps, and many of us are appreciating them for their promises to take action, violence goes on. Thousands are still fleeing. Given the experience of last 40 years, we know Myanmar regime's delaying tactics. In the UN and around the world, we have called the atrocities committed by the Myanmar authorities on the Rohingyas genocide, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity. We have talked now and in the past about taking action. We talked about accountability. We talked about never again. Now, please let us walk the talk. Thank you.
I thank the Minister for her comments, and Excellencies, colleagues, at the risk of unnecessarily prolonging this gathering, I think the message from today's meeting is very clear. The world must uphold its responsibility to protect the Rohingya people. And I would add to that, that democracy and prosperity in Myanmar cannot be built on the bones of the Rohingya. My own organization joins those who have called for the Myanmar government to immediately end the violence, to allow the safe voluntary return of all Rohingya refugees, to fully implement the recommendations of the Rakhine Commission report, to cooperate with the Human Rights Council mandated fact-finding mission, and to hold all perpetrators of atrocities accountable. Further, we believe the UN Security Council should impose an arms embargo on Myanmar and targeted sanctions against those senior military officers with command responsibility for atrocities that are being committed in northern Rakhine. And we applaud those states who have suspended ties with the Myanmar military and urge all UN member states to do the same. Colleagues, friends, I thank our co-hosts, the mission of Bangladesh. I thank the panelists. I want to acknowledge also the translators for their work. And I thank you all for your attention and patience, and I declare this